I'm just thinking like how we usually assess or screen for ADHD. We use rating scales.
Yes.
And when you think about these rating scales, most of them don't actually capture that what we're describing, the emotional distress. They're more focused on the behavior.
Yeah.
So focusing on, can this person sit still? Can they organize themselves? Are they forgetful? So rather than capturing the emotional side of it. So I think something needs to be done. I think going back to what you're saying with the criteria that we use to diagnose ADHD, which is the manual, the diagnostic manual, is again based on research.
Yes.
So these manuals are created by researchers, not by clinicians as such.
Yes.
Which can make it difficult to then. So to them, they look at numbers. Can Johnny sit still for 10 minutes, or how many times has he been getting up out of the seats? Or 3 times. It's very based on what they're seeing.
Yeah, it's very much to do with the observable signs.
Yeah.
Because the DSM is designed, I suppose, for a clinician to be able to observe someone in a consulting room and just then make a diagnosis to attach that kind of label with it. But what happens a lot with the internalized experience of ADHD is it's the internal symptoms.
Yeah.
And if you've had, this is a different way of being, your brain's wired in that way, how do you know that other people are feeling any different? It's your normal, it's your usual. And I think for me, that's where I wanted to go into ADHD coaching, because it's working with things as they are, and it's about kind of meeting that person and that pathway and saying, okay, there's some actual real strengths to this as well, this way of being.
And I'm sure some listeners might be questioning in terms of what is it that we're describing in terms of emotional dysregulation? How does that manifest? Like, if you could just maybe give us a description of how someone might be going through or presenting with these symptoms. How does that look like?
Yeah, so emotional dysregulation, it's all to do with your kind of appraisal and processing and response for any emotional regulation. So it's about kind of being able to get a clear appraisal objectively, not as you think things should be, or as the frustration of how you would want them to be, but it's about really reading the situation as it is in that moment, and then choosing the most healthiest and constructive outcome to it to get the kind of response that you need. So one that we use in DBT that comes from Marsha Linehan is, say you've gone to the shops and there's a big queue. It's not skillful or effective to let that frustration lead you out the shop and, or shouting and abusing, the people in boots. Although I'm sure that we've all felt that sometimes. It's about, going, okay, well, I just have to wait this out. I have to radically accept it is what it is. And the best outcome is for me to use maybe some strategies to keep myself regulated, keep myself calm in this moment, so I can get the outcome that it is. So in that situation, it might be to get the product that you need from the shops. With conditions such as, anxiety, depression, any of the mood disorders, any of the personality disorders, it's so much harder because of how you're feeling and you're psychologically processing the situation. So in other words, what you're thinking about the situation. With ADHD, it's really hard because there's an executive function challenge. So it's been really hard to plan to get there in the first place. And then you've got a brain that's stimulated by interest. And for example, in the shop example, it's not interesting to queue in a shop. It's, but a person with ADHD will just be really craving that interest. They'll be feeling the lack of interest, the boredom, on a very physical scale. That it will almost be painful and intolerable. I think listening to you there, I can just hear some listeners probably thinking like, I think everyone goes through that where no one likes queuing. And so where would you then differentiate between a condition such as ADHD in this case? Yeah, so I suppose with that it's the appraisal and the actual being in the moment, but it's actually the response. So, someone with ADHD might feel a bit more inclined to get so frustrated and feel it on such a painful level that, what people see is great amounts of irritation, frustration, or even kind of impulsive acts, such as throwing a bag at someone. I'm not saying that that's the case, but there's a feeling of it, there's that real urge to feel like that it's not okay.
So it's about an irrational response to a situation.
Yeah, it's about the irrational impulsive response.
Yes, of course, and particularly for younger children that I see as well, and how that can manifest in terms of their inability to regulate their emotions, whereby they can easily lash out over something that might be viewed as a trivial situation, and some people say this behavior came out of the blue, where 1 minute they were playing nicely and next minute the game didn't go their way, and next thing the table's flying, and so it's to that extent where you start to see a pattern of these traits, whereby there's clearly no signs or signals that would indicate a build up of a response to some extent.
To some extent, and people remember I've made a difference just earlier on between like the signs and the symptoms. So internally, a person might be experiencing symptoms of, I wish I could just do this, or frustration or shame or whatever it is they're feeling. But people are going to see the outside response. They're going to see the signs. So they're going to see the person in boots, shouting, tutting, and making a big, like, acting out their frustration.
Yeah.
Or it looks like the child that, is finding it really hard to pay attention, and so they're the ones that are always getting up or, looking for stimulation that might look like, pushing books off a desk or something, because it's really hard to contain that emotion when you can't regulate your attention. So with ADHD, it's that the emotional dysregulation comes more from an inability to regulate the attention and that's why we get a dysregulated emotional response. Because it's hard to stay in the moment if it's not interesting.
Is it to do with inhibition as well, would you say?
Yeah, it is to do with inhibition, because what we're looking at is, some of us in that appraisal, we go, well, I know I want to do this thing, but we have a greater sense, because of the brain wiring issue, we have a greater sense of being able to disinhibit a response, which is to control a response. But a person with ADHD, that's actually part of the criteria, that it's hard to not act impulsively sometimes. Or a person with a bit more of an inattentive picture might just literally go into what could be known as a bit of a shutdown, where they just zone out.
And we know with ADHD there is the executive functioning deficit as well alongside it. So and then you combine with the emotional dysregulation. I think it sort of goes hand in hand to an extent.
For me, I see that the emotional dysregulation in ADHD comes from that executive functioning. And that when it's really hard to kind of, executive functioning is described sometimes as the conductor that makes all the parts of your brain work, really, to bring it all in. So it's when it's really hard for that. There's just this feeling of the emotional response behind it. And just because it is, and I keep saying it, I mean, I just feel that there's a sense of everything's just a little bit more harder than it should be. And that sense of frustration is going to come out sometimes in behaviour. And that's what we can see, emotional dysregulation. But emotional dysregulation can also be, just feeling very upset, labile, crying at different points as well. It's not just I'm not saying that all, people with ADHD are angry. We're just saying that they feel things to a greater intensity, because it's hard to regulate the attention to stay calm in the moment.